Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. When I first heard about the police killing of Michael Brown, an unarmed black teenager in Ferguson, Missouri, my initial thought was, what's new? I've been reading about and reporting on horrendous police actions against black people for decades. The cell phone footage, and a warning, it's graphic, of officers in St. Louis killing 25-year-old Kajem Powell will send chills through you. It's widely available online. Also chilling is the video of the police killing of Eric Garner, a 43-year-old black man on Staten Island who died after being grabbed by police officers and held in a chokehold, even as he gasped again and again, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." His alleged offense? Selling untaxed cigarettes. That footage is also available online. But it's not just the killings. The criminal justice system often goes after black people with the vehemence of a vendetta. In the New York City Stop and Frisk campaign, nearly 4.5 million stops were made. More than 80% of the stops targeted people who were black or Latino, and in nearly 90% of the stops, those who were confronted by the police had done absolutely nothing wrong. We'll talk about these issues and more with my guest, Jenn Rolnick Borchetta, a civil rights lawyer and counsel for the New York think tank Demos, who was a senior attorney in the landmark class action lawsuit that resulted in New York's stop and frisk policy being declared unconstitutional. Jenn, welcome. Thanks for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So it seems to me that the police themselves are not very well policed. There are vast disparities in the use of violence against people. People of color, blacks and Latinos, most often get the worst of it. And this has been the case seemingly forever. I mean, I remember way back in the 1970s, there was this 10-year-old kid, Clifford Glover, in the borough of Queens in New York, and he was just shot in the back for no apparent reason by a police officer. They never came up with a reason, the officer did not go to prison for that killing. There was another one. There was a 15-year-old in Brooklyn named Randolph Evans who was shot and killed by a police officer. Again, nothing happened criminally to the officer. Any number of killings, decade after decade. What is this all about? Why has it been allowed to continue? And frankly, despite protests here and there, why is there not more of a sustained outcry against this?
I think that's a very important question, and it's a really it's a difficult question to answer. But in my opinion, having worked on the stop and frisk litigation for many years and having seen that trial and the great public interest in the trial and the great public outcry at the evidence we were presenting at that trial, I think part of it is that it's complicated, that I believe there's an issue of implicit bias in policing. I believe it exists at various levels within an institution like the NYPD, which itself is a huge institution. So you have supervisors who are turning away when they see that officers under their supervision are violating people's constitutional rights. You have high-ranking NYPD officers who are telling rank-level officers to go out and get stops of people of color in order to prove that they're doing their jobs. And this creates a vicious cycle that's very hard to break and very hard to challenge.
Do they actually, now you were immersed in the stop and frisk litigation beginning to end. When the officers, when the commanders send these officers out on stop and frisk and they tell them, you know, you have to meet your numbers, you know, there are quotas, whether they admit it or not. How do they tell them that we want you to go after people of color, or do they say or imply such a thing?
Well, in high ranks of the NYPD, we were able to elicit some testimony that they would say things to officers like, go out and get us stops of the right people. And they would use that phrase, the right people. And then when they're saying this, they're saying it in a context of who are the people that commit crimes. And that is drawing on abstract data that's not necessarily tied to who's actually committing the types of crimes that officers are conducting stops for. So stops are often things like, it looks like someone might be about to break into a car, or it looks like someone might have an open container of alcohol, things of that nature. Whereas crime statistics that the NYPD was drawing some kind of racial data come from much more serious crimes and are not representative of those same crimes. And they would extrapolate that and then connect the two, say, get us stops of those right people. And by doing that, they were really sending a message, get us stops of black and brown people.
So make the leap from these stops, these confrontations on the street, to those situations that we see very often now videotaped, where individuals are physically abused, sometimes badly beaten, in many cases killed, shot to death, for often no apparent reason. How do we get from one to the other? In other words, if you have police officers who are committing unjustified killings, why would there be a disproportion in the ethnic background of the people who are the victims of those killings?
It's a combination, I think, of both what these officers are being pressured to do and the implicit biases that officers themselves might hold, sometimes explicit biases. But people in this country are routinely inundated with a vision of the black body as being violent, as being a threat. And we all absorb this to some degree. And if you're getting pressure from high ranks of your employer to go out there and do these stops, and you're also at the same time very afraid, you're triggered, I think, more easily. And also there's the problem that there isn't real discipline on the back end, that officers who maybe commit some lower level of misconduct, not killing, but something less, but serious, it's not taken seriously, it's not disciplined, and that itself sends a message that officers can overreact and it will be condoned.
So you won the Stop and Frisk lawsuit. The Stop and Frisk, as it was carried out by the New York City Police Department, was declared unconstitutional. And the new administration of Mayor Bill de Blasio is not appealing that lawsuit and has changed the city's policy, and so Stop and Frisk has been reeled in. Or has it? What's going on in terms of Stop and Frisk right now?
Well, there's one question about the numbers of stops being conducted. It's being reported that there's a decrease in the number of stops, and there's a question of whether it really has, and if so, how much.
A sharp decrease.
There has been reporting of a sharp decrease. Officers, when they conduct a stop or a frisk, are supposed to fill out a form called a UF-250. The reason we know all the numbers that you started this program with is because of looking at data culled from those 250 documents. But there was evidence during the Floyd trial, the Stop and Frisk trial, that officers were being instructed recently to not fill those forms out all the time. And so there is some indication that some of the decrease, at least, could be from officers simply not filling out the forms as much. There's also reporting from communities that are mostly targeted by this practice that they're not seeing a difference. And one thing that I think you hit on is that Mayor de Blasio has said when he came into office that he would remedy the stop and frisk practice, but simply reducing the number of stop and frisks is not getting at the real problems. It's not getting at the problems that led to this racial discrimination and the use of this practice in the first instance. It's not getting to the problems of supervision, of discipline, and those things are right now not being remedied because the NYPD unions have sought to continue the appeal despite that the city does not want to.
So the city is not appealing, and that would indicate in most cases that this was at an end. There wouldn't be any more case. There's been a ruling, and the ruling is not being appealed. But the police union has decided they want the ruling appealed. So what's that about?
The police unions, after there was a trial decision, asked the court for intervention. That's what it's called in legalese. And what that means is they're saying they have a right in this case to be a party. But they really don't. And the lower court, the lower federal court, denied their request to come into the case, saying you have no rights here. You're not against the citizens of New York in this case. They have appealed that decision to the federal appellate court, and they're asking the federal appellate court to let them in. And while that motion is pending, which it's being argued next week, while that's pending, the remedies in the case are still being on hold.
If the appellate court does not let them in, is it finally over?
Yes.
Okay. But there's always a but. And this one is your fault. You've made the connection between stop and frisk on the one hand and the broken windows model of policing on the other hand, which is a type of policing championed by Bill Bratton, the current police commissioner. So talk about that connection.
Well, one of the concerns that I have is that because Commissioner Bratton is such a champion of broken windows policing, and because the remedies to the broken problems in the NYPD that led to racial discrimination and stop and frisk are not being changed, these are going to cause the same sorts of problems in broken windows. Broken windows policing is targeting small or minor infractions in order to try to deter crime. Stop and frisk is one tactic within the broken windows panoply of approaches.
Stop and frisk is actually part of broken windows policing.
Exactly, precisely. And those types of minor interactions allow a lot of discretion on the part of officers and also require officers to prove that they're doing something in a way that will bring up the same issues that stop and frisk brought up and the same problems if there's not adequate discipline for unconstitutional interactions, if there's not adequate containing of messages to the police to go out there and stop people despite their constitutional rights, which is the same problem that caused the racial discrimination and stop and frisk.
So the New York Civil Liberties Union did an analysis of, interventions or summonses for minor offenses. This could be riding your bicycle on the sidewalk or drinking from an open container or maybe spitting on the sidewalk, whatever. And it found that more than 80% of the summonses were issued to people who were African American or Latino. Does it surprise you that it's so lopsided, that 80%?
It doesn't surprise me. I've done a lot of police misconduct type of work in addition to the stop and frisk case, and this is what you see. It's a targeting of people of color with the police force, and it's unfortunate because it ensnares people in the criminal process, and it really disturbs people's lives. You
are against the way New York used stop and frisk, as I have been for a long time. I wrote a lot about that. You have serious concerns about broken windows policing, and I have seen the disproportionate way that some of these broken windows policies are enforced. But nobody here is in favor of crime or criminal behavior. So what kind of policing should we be looking for? How do we begin to fight crime in the proper way without infringing on the rights, especially of innocent people? One thing the police need to do is understand constitutional limitations, because our Constitution recognizes that there's a limitation on when police can act, because if police act arbitrarily, it undermines both public safety and public confidence, and that's something we see time and again. It doesn't do the community any good to have police acting arbitrarily. So in the first instance, police need to be respectful. They need to react to actual misconduct and to understand what misconduct looks like and to have adequate training to recognize that and supervision that guides them into making those really nuanced decisions in a way that is fair and reasonable and constitutional. If you're stopped by a police officer in New York or anywhere in the United States for that matter, what are you required to do? Are you required to have an identification? Are you required to answer an officer's questions? There's what's legally required and what you should do in a broader sense. And legally, no, you do not have to show an officer your identification. You don't have to answer an officer unless you are detained, and the officer should tell you if you are. If you are not allowed to go, an officer should tell you that. And unless an officer says that, you're allowed to go. And what if an officer says, and I've seen this happen, get off the street corner. What do you do then?
Again,
you're not doing anything illegal, but you know.
Right. There's what you can do and what you should do. What you should do is a personal decision, because unfortunately, if you don't listen to officers, they're likely to escalate their attention to you. And that can end badly, especially for people of color, when it's shown that officers are quicker to force.
And we've seen that time and again.
Right, exactly.
You have to use your own discretion. But does this lead us to a situation where, based on people's color, you frequently have no real recourse?
Unfortunately, I think that that's often how it feels to people in these situations, and that's why this is so dehumanizing and demoralizing, that people feel that they have to succumb, even if they weren't doing anything wrong, even if they're innocent of any wrongdoing. And you know, there are studies showing that stop and frisk and practices like it, when it's used outside of the appropriate boundaries, it leads to a decrease in civic engagement in communities. I mean, people feel like they're less citizens, and it has ramifications for voting, for democracy, for all of it.
You are not just involved in criminal matters, even though that's what we've been talking about, but you're a civil rights attorney. You've been involved in voting rights cases. You've been involved in cases involving discrimination that prevent people from accessing opportunity and that sort of thing. So let's talk about that a little bit in the few minutes we have left. And let's start with voting rights. It seems a little weird to me that we even have to be talking about voting rights nearly 50 years after you know, the great Voting Rights Act of 1965. And yet we do have to talk about it. What's been going on, and what's the outlook?
Right now, there is a lot of activity around voting rights, and it's, I think, because of two reasons. One is that states before the 2008 election, they increased access to democracy, increased voting hours, increased when people could register to vote, things like that. And it led to a huge influx of African American voters in the elections in 2008 and 2012. Then in 2013, the Supreme Court really gutted the Voting Rights Act, and that unleashed a beast. And in response, the day after that, for example, the day after the Supreme Court's decision gutting the Voting Rights Act, the state of North Carolina, which would have had to get pre-clearance or would have had to get permission from the government to change its voting laws, rolled back all of those methods for voting that had increased access to democracy in 2008 and 2012. They rolled it back. That led to a number of court challenges, and it's now gone up to the Supreme Court. There are a number of challenges right now in that area, and there's a flurry of state legislators that are trying to roll back access to democracy, and this is a reason that we need to legislatively restore the Voting Rights Act.
You and Demos have been in the midst of this fight. People are really fighting back against voter suppression. There are many cases, as you just pointed out, that are in the courts. We're awaiting resolution in some cases. But describe the trends. Are we making headway, or are we falling backwards? Are you optimistic?
I think that we're taking a step back. We're also taking steps forwards. There are states that are increasing same-day voter registration, for example, which increases the ability of people to go out and vote. But we do see a lot of these trends right now, especially, that are burdening particularly people of color, and it's a big concern. They're carving out, state legislators are carving out voting access specifically that will have a heavier burden on African Americans. And
in other words, you're targeting African American voters.
Precisely, yeah. Precisely.
Now, when Barack Obama was elected, when he was first elected, there was all this talk about a post-racial society, which I said, and probably in print at the time, that this was nuts. We are not in a post-racial society. But we're now seeing things like, you know, the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, and we're seeing all these other problems. To what extent do we still have to fight back against serious problems of discrimination in areas like housing, in areas like employment, in areas like schooling, What's the landscape like there?
I think we need to push back. We need to recognize, vocalize, and challenge when we see racial bias, when we see it either in intent or in effect, because it is still a problem and it is still bubbling up. And I think one of the issues is being able to recognize when it's happening, and at the same time recognizing efforts that increase, for example, access to democracy. Let's take that. Increase access to democracy for all Americans. Things like voter registration, for example. Making sure that all people are brought in so that if there, to the extent discrimination persists, and it very much does, we can counter it by ensuring that we're bringing people into the process while others might be trying to keep them out.
Are there still serious problems of, for example, employment discrimination or housing discrimination?
Yes, and in employment discrimination is a good example. There are certain practices that we're seeing in certain sectors right now, particularly in retail, for example. Abusive scheduling practices is an example, where employees are given short notice of their shifts. There's some reports showing that some employees, 1 in 2 employees, only get a week's notice of when their shift will be. 1 in 5 get only 3 days notice of when their shifts will be, and their shifts fluctuate. Reports show that these practices are more severely falling on people of color, that people of color get less notice of their schedules, that they get worse hours and worse shifts. And to the extent that exists, it needs to be challenged. And employers need to be ensuring that these practices from the get-go don't occur, meaning that people are given notice so that they can have stable, predictable jobs, so that all workers can, but especially because to the extent it has a worse effect on African Americans by ensuring that it's a better policy for all workers, again, you bring up everyone.
Do you know, you mentioned that even when when there's no intent to discriminate, but if that becomes the effect, if people are discriminated, you know, and that wasn't the point, it's still a problem, and you still need to fight against it. And you talk about things like implicit biases. These are very subtle areas that you're getting into. How do you begin to convey the message to people that they should be concerned about these sorts of things? If they're inclined just to not pay attention to it and say enough already, what's your response?
That what happens to some Americans is really affecting all of us. And what pulls some people down might pull all of us down. And also that if study after study shows that people of color are lagging behind in a number of areas, economics, education, I mean, the pillars of American life. And the reason for that is because they were discriminated against for so long, and that there is still discrimination. And that if they aren't able to succeed, then that's a drain on the American economy generally, and we should all care about that.
Now, how'd you get into this racket? You know, you could have gone into corporate law or banking law or something like that and made gazillions of dollars, and instead, oh my goodness, it's like working in the mines. Did you want to do this all along?
I did, and I started out in commercial litigation.
You did?
I did, but always wanting to do this work, and I actually made a very risky decision to quit a corporate job and volunteer in this area because it was what I really wanted to do. And for me, I truly believe that what happens to my neighbors is happening to me. I believe that there are real racial equity problems in this country, and that we all need to grapple with them in order for the American dream to be real for the entire country.
So you are a colleague of mine at DEMO, so I know the answer to this question, but you feel, or do you feel that you made the right decision when you made that transition?
I absolutely feel I made the right decision, and it's very fulfilling work, but it's also, I think you get to work with people in a way that allows a lot of collaboration and sparks a lot of creativity when you're working with people who come from different backgrounds, who have different experiences.
Jenn Rolnick Borchetta, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. Is it possible that the most popular courses on college campuses in America are the ones that lead to the least job and career satisfaction? That's the case according to a survey of 30,000 graduates conducted by the Gallup organization and Purdue University. Business courses are the most popular, but they are far from the most rewarding. The poll found that business graduates were the ones who tended to be the most bored and the least satisfied with their jobs. On the whole, they were less engaged professionally than students who had majored in such categories as the social sciences and education, or the arts and humanities, or science and engineering. Business courses don't even lead to the biggest economic payoff. According to the Wall Street Journal, that honor falls to science and engineering graduates. In other words, there's a lifetime's worth of wisdom in that old adage, do what you love. That's all for now. See you next time.